Al-Qaeda is on the run.
Can we succeed? We can.
In Afghanistan, the maximum estimate is less than 100.
Level the building.
Its leaders targeted and killed from Indonesia to Somalia. So who's responsible for this? And this? And this? And why is Barack Obama considering committing an additional 40,000 troops, $700 billion, and his presidency to war?
This is fundamental to the defense of our people.
This is empire. Hello and welcome to Empire. I am Marwan Bishara. For 8 years, the most powerful military alliance on the planet has chased a ragtag guerrilla group living in caves and on the run in Afghanistan, as if they were a superpower army. After deploying 30,000 additional troops over the last year, US generals are demanding 40,000 more to defeat Al-Qaeda and its allies, the Taliban. All of which beg a number of questions. Do 100 Al-Qaeda militants merit more than 100,000 NATO troops? Is Al-Qaeda Central still indispensable for planning attacks worldwide? And would the Taliban share its global quest against the West? On the other hand, does stabilizing Afghanistan justifies destabilizing nuclear Pakistan? And if Washington withdraws its troops, will the Taliban take the war back to America or once again provide safe haven for Al-Qaeda after experiencing firsthand America's wrath? I will address these issues and more with my distinguished panel. General Richard Myers, former chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff and author of Eyes on the Horizon, serving on the front lines of national security, as well as Dr. Mark Sageman, sociologist, former CIA case officer, and New York Police Department scholar in residence, author of Leaderless Jihad, Terror Networks in the 21st Century. And Robert Pape, professor of political science at the University of Chicago and author of Dying to Win, The Strategic Logic of Suicide Terrorism. And last but not least, investigative reporter Lawrence Wright, fellow at the Center of Law and Security and author of The Looming Tower, Al-Qaeda and the Road to 9/11. But first, a look at Al-Qaeda and America's state of play in Afghanistan and Pakistan.
We will never waver. Pursuit of Al-Qaeda.
We must destroy Al-Qaeda, or at a minimum move it.
Al-Qaeda is said to be a threat to global security. But take away the hype and the enemy is suddenly a lot less impressive.
Al-Qaeda is not based in Afghanistan.
The Al-Qaeda presence is very diminished. The maximum estimate is less than 100 operating in the country.
So how can just 100 or so fighters tie down the most powerful military nations on Earth for so long? This is the Taliban in action. A suicide bomber kills the guard outside the Ministry of Culture in Kabul before shooting his way in and blowing himself up. The whole thing recorded as propaganda. It's a new level of sophistication that confirms what some military analysts and Afghan government officials have been warning of for some time, that Al-Qaeda is now working with the Taliban.
It's able to provide technical assistance, it's able to provide resources, it's able to work with them, it's able to bring fighters for them.
And some Taliban leaders publicly boast about their closeness to Al-Qaeda.
Al-Qaeda and the Taliban are all Muslims. We are united by the Brotherhood of Islam. We do not see any difference between the Taliban and Al-Qaeda, for we all belong to the religion of Islam.
More proof, these fighters are not Afghans. Abu Abbas Maghribi, seen here training. Other names on the video, Abu Zakr from Algeria, and the list goes on. Foreign fighters seem to be the Afghan army's worst nightmare.
The enemy has changed. The numbers have increased. There are about 4,000 fighters, mostly from Chechnya, North Africa and Pakistan, involved in the fighting in Afghanistan.
The defense minister's comments were made to the Afghan lower house of parliament, but his message was directed to the White House. On the ground at al-Qaeda Central, there are few doubts that the game has changed.
Some of them have direct links with al-Qaeda, exact ideological origin, and planning from al-Qaeda.
The Taliban says the group doesn't have an agenda to attack other countries, but is simply fighting to liberate its own from foreign occupation.
Intelligence and other sources say Osama bin Laden and al-Qaeda slipped across the border into Pakistan, where they have regrouped and have joined forces with the Pakistani Taliban. Asked if al-Qaeda had the strength on the ground,
they have their foot soldiers who do the job for them. They themselves, I do not think, are involved in implementing their objectives. But at strategic planning level, of course, they are involved.
Stand by. The US has launched drone attacks to take out suspected al-Qaeda leaders.
Yeah, direct hits right there.
But the bombs don't differentiate between al-Qaeda fighters and civilians. Casualties have been high, and this indiscriminate bombing campaign has pushed many Pakistanis into the arms of the insurgents, whether they're al-Qaeda or the Taliban, who have declared war on the state. In the past few weeks, Pakistan has been under attack from the border region of Peshawar to Lahore in the south. The Pakistani military has launched a huge offensive in South Waziristan to clean out the Taliban and al-Qaeda strongholds. This comes months after they did the same thing in the Swat Valley. In a message to the Pakistani military, released just days before the assault on South Waziristan, Osama bin Laden's second-in-command, Dr. Ayman al-Zawahiri, accused Pakistan of being an American stooge and warned of swift reprisals. Whether these are just idle threats and the links between the Pakistani Taliban and al-Qaeda are mere insurgent fantasies, it seems that the entire region is descending into chaos.
General Myers, 100 al-Qaeda militants, over 100,000 NATO troops. Now they want to escalate with more troops. Why don't they just declare victory against al-Qaeda, find a political solution with the Taliban, and get out?
It was 19 al-Qaeda that perpetrated the acts of 9/11. So that was sort of, I think, the government, U.S. government's view before 9/11, 2001, was, gee, they're not a very large group. What can they do? But I think they showed what they can do on 9/11. So they don't need a lot if they're willing to risk their lives, give their lives.
But does America need a lot to fight them?
You brought up the point, can we try to negotiate with the Taliban in Afghanistan? I think you could probably negotiate with some. Some are pretty hardcore that would share beliefs much like al-Qaeda's beliefs and would probably not go easily. They would probably not be brought into the tent easily.
Mark Sageman, do you think that al-Qaeda in Afghanistan is indispensable for future attacks like 9/11?
There is no al-Qaeda in Afghanistan. Al-Qaeda is in Pakistan.
Right.
I'm not sure what we're doing.
So is there a military solution to al-Qaeda then, since they keep slipping through borders?
No, I don't think that you use the military to defeat a terrorist group. Usually it's law enforcement, sometimes political solution. Now the problem on what to do is that we use the same terms to really mean a lot of different things. There are many Talibans. There are Talibans in Pakistan, and they're not all united. There are Talibans in Afghanistan, they're not united. And then the same thing, people just focus on al-Qaeda, whereas a lot of the plots that go back to the federally administered tribal area where most of those groups are located, that's in Pakistan, a lot of them are rivals of al-Qaeda. So what we have is a complete confusion because we use the same term to really denote a lot of different things.
I would agree that that when you're confronting groups like the al-Qaeda, and I say groups, plural, that the military instrument of power can't be your primary instrument. There's a place for the military instrument of power, but it's the other instruments of power that will eventually perhaps lead to a place where jihad is not as popular as it is today, or is used by these groups. And so you talk about the political instrument of power, the economic instrument of power, as opposed to thinking it can all be done with military force, which I don't believe anybody actually in the U.S. military believes that as well. But
well, I agree there should be a balance, but right now it's 90% military and at most 10% economic and political.
Not even.
And in fact, because it's 90% military, we're generating more suicide attackers than we're killing. We toppled the Taliban in 2001 with, what, 2,500 American boots on the ground at most. We used air power, made deals with groups on the ground. And then for years, there was almost no sign of deterioration, teeny tiny amounts of terrorism. And what we decided to do was to go after that teeny tiny amounts of terrorism with an increasingly heavy military footprint that by definition was going to ram itself through civilian areas. When you go from 2,500 to now 100,000, it's no wonder suicide attacks jump from 9 a year in 2005 to 97 in 2006, and we've stayed at that tenfold increase ever since we've had this large-scale military presence.
Lawrence, it seems to me that the military, in the end of the day, serves a policy and a strategy, and that's set up by the civilians in Washington. Do the civilians in Washington see the difference between Taliban's goals and that of al-Qaeda, and why Taliban perhaps is more nationalistic and local, different from al-Qaeda, it's more global in its quest?
I don't think so. I mean, we're choosing to wage war against the Taliban, which is not exactly our enemy. Al-Qaeda is. By waging war on Taliban as if it's al-Qaeda, we are, I think, increasing the fusion of these two entities, and which, you know, when we were first in Afghanistan and our military was there, our footprint, I think, was appropriate. But then when we went into Iraq, it allowed this kind of security vacuum to take place, and the Taliban began to resume. We had a great sense of paranoia that Afghanistan would become once again a sanctuary for al-Qaeda. And that is a very dangerous situation, and one that we should try our best to prevent. But trying to secure the entire country to prevent the Taliban from taking over parts of it that we can't control, we're not going to be able to achieve that.
Marxism does it even matter? I mean, 9/11 wasn't even planned in Afghanistan. Apparently it was planned in Hamburg, Germany. So what if there are some elements of al-Qaeda? What is this with this jumping from fire hoops that disturbs people so much in Washington? You need to rent a U-Haul, not jump from a fire hoop to carry a terrorist attack.
I think you're right. There is a mission creep here. Originally, the mission was to defend the homeland of the United States and the homeland of our Western allies. Now, the Taliban, the Afghan Taliban, I should say, has never really left the country. It's a very local resistance movement, and it's very hard to uproot it. But that does not, in a sense, affect the United States. We have no real vital interest in Afghanistan, only to the extent that our defense of the homeland is concerned.
There were training camps that mattered for 9/11, but they were American flight schools. That was the critical operational training that made 9/11 possible. I'm not trying to say that we should just ignore Tarnak Farms. That's the large camp that bin Laden had in Afghanistan. But if you ever saw a picture of Tarnak Farms, this was not 3 little huts put together, mud huts. This was basically a military base. So the problem was we couldn't find it. The problem was we didn't do much really about that. And that's only a secondary issue, because the main issue with suicide attacks is simply getting the suicide attackers. It's not actually training them. That's the relatively easy part. The key question is what motivates them, because once they're motivated, then they'll acquire the training, and we're motivating more than we're killing.
Let's talk about motivation. General Myers, not only there is a plan to escalate in Afghanistan, but increasingly, if you look at the last few days, Pakistan, the country that elected more or less a liberal government, is being destabilized for the sake of perhaps stabilizing Afghanistan. Why is Washington putting so much pressure on the Pakistani government to wage yet another war?
The Pakistani government has its own interest here, and as they saw when the Pakistani Taliban come pretty close to Islamabad, actually, in the Swat Valley, and they push back, and now they're pushing back in South Waziristan, which has been a place where they've been unsuccessful before, the Pakistani army, that is. But I think a lot of that's for their own survival. And
you see the bombings now all over Pakistan, closing the schools.
But that's part of this, my view, this overall global insurgency of like-minded, not monolithic certainly, but like-minded organizations that want to delegitimize legitimate government. As I would say the Taliban are trying to do in Afghanistan as well. That's the bigger worry in Afghanistan is not the Taliban or whatever group, it's the violence they will perpetrate to delegitimize the central government that is, after all, the product of a constitution that the Afghan people adopted. So how much you think you need to help in that regard? Not to argue that that the Karzai government is the best in governance and so forth, not to argue that at all, but to argue that the process, constitution, elections, a government, is an important process, at least as the West sees it.
Lawrence, I profiled back in 1992 Osama bin Laden and the Arab Afghans, back in 1992. And I had one conclusion about them, that they strive on the mistakes of American foreign policy. That is their biggest reservoir of support of fertile grounds in the Arab world. And those sorts of policies in Pakistan and Afghanistan seems to do exactly that, still increase the recruits for al-Qaeda.
Well, in fact, that was the whole goal of attacking America, is to draw America into Afghanistan, just as in bin Laden's mind. The same thing would happen to the United States as happened to the Soviet Union. You know, when the Soviets went in and for 10 years, they finally come out, and what happens? The Soviet Union falls apart. Well, in bin Laden's mind, the same thing would happen to the United States. It would become the disunited States. He actually believed that. And I think it was a stunning surprise to him when, in 6 weeks, you know, a few American special operatives and air power and the troops of the Northern Alliance accomplish what the Red Army hadn't been able to do in 10 years. They just completely swept aside the Taliban and pummeled al-Qaeda, and the war on terror at that point was essentially over. Since then, the unintended consequences of our foreign policies have been really quite disastrous and have revivified al-Qaeda as a movement, at least, and created a widespread sympathy for an organization at that point was repudiated all over the world, even in the Muslim world.
Mark Sisman, do you think the foreign policy mistakes or non-mistakes, even if they are intended foreign policy, are fueling more and more extremism that eventually will come back and haunt the United States?
Let me point out that the Red Army did take hold of Afghanistan within a few days. They had problem holding it.
Yes.
It's really quite different. We also took over Afghanistan with very few troops over 6 weeks, but we have trouble holding it. The problem is not really taking control of Afghanistan, it's really holding it. Nobody has been able to do this. Not even Afghans have been able to do that because they've been always involved in civil war. Now, I'm not really sure that the al-Qaeda appeal is growing in the Middle East. If anything, it's actually decreasing. It's decreasing in the West. This is not, you know, young Westerners going to Iraq to die, as we saw in 2004 and 2005. That has decreased drastically. If you see the number of plots
but I'm sorry, Mark, but this is exactly what the paradox is. On the one hand, in the Middle East, and the Greater Middle East, al-Qaeda is no longer popular because of its unsavory practices. But on the other hand, they keep picking up some extra support precisely because of the chaos that keeps on going in the Middle East because of the American policies.
That's partially true. Right now, the big appeal of al-Qaeda-like organization, because it no longer is just al-Qaeda, is amongst the Germans and the Turks. You don't really see as many British or French people going there, or even American. And the great appeal is Somalia right now, especially with Somali diaspora around the world. Within the Middle East, al-Qaeda has lost a lot of support.
Do you mind, just before we go to break, I need General Myers to comment just on this very specific point. You were Chairman of Joint Chiefs of Staff from 2000 to 2004. You served in Iraq. In retrospect, General, do you think this was one big blunder, the invasion of Iraq?
I think at the time we thought violent extremists, if they got their hands on weapons of mass destruction, which presumably Iraq had, that would be a real danger. So I think from that standpoint.
But now, in retrospect, do you agree with President Obama this was a complete distraction from the war on terror?
That's a political question. You just put the president there. I'm not going to get into the politics.
Okay, from your own experience, really, retroactively, do you think this was a blunder or not?
I think if you look at Iraq today, I don't think you can call it a blunder. I think you see an Iraq that has an emerging democracy, relatively stable as things in that part of the world.
And the heavy price paid over the last 6 years?
I think
hundreds of thousands of dead.
I think the Iraqis that I've spoken to, certainly U.S. troops, think that mission was worth it, and it's still worth it.
By the way, I don't think it's over yet. But anyway,
I don't know that it is either.
We need to take a news break. But before we do, I will leave you with a report on how al-Qaeda has taken its fight online.
This man is about to kill himself on camera.
ما لك عندنا يا أمريكا إلا الدقم إجابتي بيدي وإجابتي تنتي قنينتي بصفي.
Abu Muawiyah is a suicide bomber for al-Qaeda in Iraq. He's about to ram his car loaded with explosives into a checkpoint manned by US and Iraqi soldiers. For al-Qaeda, his smile for the camera is also a weapon of war.
Allahu Akbar. Allahu Akbar. Allahu Akbar.
This is the jihadi propaganda machine, designed to inspire its supporters and terrify its enemies. There are hundreds of these videos on the net. More are uploaded almost every day.
Internet is key to al-Qaeda. They are putting the emphasis on this virtual jihad and hoping that somebody somewhere would perpetrate a new attack.
Al-Qaeda's sole means of communicating with the outside world is through the internet, through websites such as Sahab and others. They're on YouTube, Facebook, and it's being accessed now by tens of thousands of people.
The videos are from Iraq, Afghanistan, Somalia, wherever jihadi Muslims are fighting what they see as an American-led Crusader alliance attacking Islam.
Al-Qaeda and other groups are keen to document all their operations, whether training or attacks, because they know that the current global battle with America is in the media.
But who actually watches these videos? And what effect are they having on the young people in the Muslim world and in the West?
I think Al-Qaeda combines both communication on the internet to rally the troops, to feed the victimhood, to give them a sense of vision as to where they want to go. But at the same time, they have sufficient foot soldiers now in the form of the Pakistani Taliban and others who are prepared to not just observe and talk, but walk the walk and undertake terrorist action. It's a combination of the two.
To win a war, you don't need to kill everybody on the enemy side. What you need is to break their will to fight and inspire your own side never to surrender. That's why propaganda has always been as important as military operations. And for al-Qaeda, the internet is the perfect weapon.
The modern way is the internet. Someone edits the film at home, then burns it onto a CD and takes it to any internet cafe, where he can log on to certain sites, upload the film and leave. The entire operation wouldn't take you more than 5 minutes.
The combination of high-tech communications and fanaticism has proven a lethal mix.
Al-Qaeda is trying to establish a new cult, a new religion, which is a jihadi cult. And to promote this cult, they need a medium. And this medium is internet.
So, with websites preaching global jihad mushrooming all over the internet with impunity, does this mean the virtual war is already lost?
I don't think it's possible for someone to just go on the internet and get self-radicalized and decide to go and blow themselves up. But what it does do is those who are already on the Salafi jihadi conveyor belt, it makes it easier for them to want to become the martyr, to want to become the brother who's respected after his death. Websites are mere symptoms of a deeper problem.